Greetings and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Hope everyone's doing well as always. This is Unit 2, Colonial America, and we're looking at Section 3 today, New France. And our previous videos and discussions in class, we've looked at what is a colony and how does it benefit the mother country, mercantilism, and we looked at New Spain just most recently. So now we're going to move on to New France and look at what their contributions kind of are and what we can do with them. And in large part, the French came a little bit later than the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish were led by Christopher Columbus, 1492. So they kind of had the head start. The French, of course, heard about this. They want to get in on the ball game because remember, wealth equals power. And there's only so much wealth in the world, and the French definitely wanted their slice of wealth. So they're going to continue to look for a passageway to Asia, specifically China and India. This is called that Northwest Passage. It is an all-water route to Asia. The French hope to find that through what is now Canada, through the Arctic, and so forth. And guys, it really just does not exist. I mean, it kind of does, but it's closed due to ice most of the year. But what the French quickly realized is after they claimed Canada in about 1534, that there were a lot of resources in North America. Their attention didn't have to be on China, on India. It could also be on North America as well. And that there were numerous resources in Canada, in North America, that the French really envied. And in fact, in New France, their area of settlement here in America, the most important economic activity was by far, that's right, it was the fur trade. By far, the fur trade is going to dominate the French economy here in North America. There's going to be a lot of different furs that the French are going to export back to France, but by and large, the most important, the one that was literally gold in their pocket, was what you see on the screen right now, beaver fur. So at the time, a very fashionable piece of clothing was the beaver fur hats and coats and capes that the wealthy elite wore back in France. This was something that had been going on for a while, and in fact, the beaver had been hunted almost to extinction back in Europe. But when the French got to North America and they looked at all the vast waterways that America has, they could find beaver just about in every stream in northern Canada and in northern what is now the United States. And so this beaver is going to become very, very lucrative for the French. And what they would actually do is they were going to use the fur, not the hide, the fur. And the fur is removed from the hide. It is matted into a felt-like substance. That is what the hats and the coats and capes are going to be cut from, is this felt-like beaver fur. And it is waterproof. It is warm and insulating. And so this beaver is very, very highly prized. And so France is primarily in North America to get furs. And we see our fur traders here. This is a much, much later, but George Caleb Bingham is a Missouri artist. He painted a lot of scenes of Missouri history and Missouri life. And this particular one, it's a fur trader coming down the Missouri. He is French with his half French son in his pirogue with him. And so these people have been out in the wild. They have been trying to trade with native people for furs. And that's kind of the basis of what we're going to be talking about here today. The French are going to use those waterways. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Waterways are the super highways, the interstate highways of the time. And they're going to have access to much of the interior of North America because they're using those highways, those waterways to travel. And this is going to lead to very large territorial claims by the French. In fact, look at the map. This is similar to the other map we've used, and we'll come back to that map in a moment. But this map does a really good job of showing where the French claimed land. Notice the title. It says territorial claims. So we want to look at the blue wedge right in the middle of the continent here. This is the area of Canada and what is now the United States that the French claimed. But check out the next map. This is areas of settlement. Land claims, areas of settlement. So what does this tell you about the actual French population in the Americas? The land claim itself and the actual areas of settlement. What does this tell you? Well, it should tell you a couple of things. First of all, that the French established their cities or forts right on the waterways, right? Okay, that's one thing. The second thing it should tell you is that there are very few actual colonists. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. Very few Frenchmen actually came to New France and stayed. Now, some came for a few years or 10, but they often went back to France as a wealthy people. But many did not stay. Now, there are exceptions to that, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. But very few colonists. The French, they've been here in Canada for a number of years, but in 1673, we have two individuals who kind of make their mark here. Father Jacques Marquette and the fur trader Louis Joliet. We often call him Marquette and Joliet. Marquette is a French Catholic priest, and Joliet is a French fur trader. They are going to leave out of Fort Mackinac, which is, I'm going to go back to the map for a moment. Fort Mackinac is this little fort right here on the very northern tip of Michigan. It is right between three of the Great Lakes. So a very strategic place for a fort, especially one that is involved in the fur trade. But Marquette and Joliet are going to leave from Fort Mackinac. They are going to go through what is now Lake Michigan. They're going to come down the Mississippi River all the way to what is now Arkansas. And they are going to confirm that, in fact, the Mississippi empties into the Gulf of Mexico. They're really kind of the first Europeans to really say definitively this happened. And they are also going to note all the natural resources along that massive river waterway. And most importantly, Marquette and Joliet are going to establish great relations with the American Indians in the region. They are going to lay the bedrock, the foundation for the French fur trade in the middle part of the Americas for about the next 150 years. Marquette and Joliet, this is their kind of big contribution. Confirms the Mississippi and make great relationships with native tribes. The second individual, about 10 years later, 1682, was Robert de La Salle, or Robert de La Salle, I guess I probably should say in French. Again, my French is terrible. But he, too, explored the Mississippi. He did not stop in Arkansas, but instead went all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And La Salle is the one who turns around and says, okay, all of the land drained by this mighty river, by the Mississippi, now belongs to France. I claim this in the name of the king, King Louis XIV. And he named this new land Louisiana in honor of his king, Louis XIV. And so La Salle is going to give the French this incredibly large territory to claim and to exploit for its natural resources. And so we look at the map. Louisiana, guys, is not the modern state of Louisiana like we think of it. This is all Louisiana. This is all Louisiana. The lands drained by the Mississippi. Guys, you got to think in terms of geography here. Appalachian Mountains run right here. If rain falls on the eastern side of those mountains, the water is going to be drained eventually into the Atlantic. If it falls on the western side of those mountains, it's got to flow downhill into the Ohio or the Cumberland or the Tennessee, eventually reaching the Mississippi and then the Gulf of Mexico. Same thing here with the Rocky Mountains. So the Rockies and the Appalachians form this valley, the Mississippi River Valley. That is what LaSalle is claiming for France and what he called Louisiana. Now, this is Canada up here. We have Quebec, we have Montreal. Those are going to be their big primary ports, or cities rather. But the middle part of America is where what we are talking about in our class as being Louisiana. And here's LaSalle claiming Louisiana for the French. He ordered his men to erect a large post with a big metal plate bolted to it, saying this land now belongs to the French. A very fanciful painting, of course, showing the natives looking on in peace and everything. And they were peaceful with the French. They got along great with the French. But in reality, the French and the Indians here, in this case, the Indians probably really did not know what was happening. So what about the French here? French population, as I said, is going to be very small. And although there were several thousand French who came to America, most returned within a year to 10, hopefully with their pockets full of money. That was their goal. In fact, at any given time, there were probably only about 3,000 French in North America. And so this population is very, very low. But you have to think for a moment, back to when we talked about the Spanish population, 200,000 Spaniards. They were here as conquerors, remember? They were here as conquerors of the native people. They had to keep the native people in line. They had to keep the native people as slaves and force them to work. The French come with a very different mindset of how to deal with the natives. It was not as conquerors, but they came with their hands stretched out in peace. And so they don't need the large numbers of people to maintain control. The French who come are going to be adventurers. They are going to be people who are here to make money. And so the population is going to remain pretty low. And they're going to actually create a lot of settlements. Now, the point of these settlements is as a trading post, a place where natives could bring their furs and exchange those furs for trade goods. What type of trade goods? How about metal knives? How about cooking pots made from metal, cast iron, wool blankets, colorful cloth, and glass beads, all kinds of things that the natives desired, and they're willing to trade hides and skins and furs to the French for those items. And so the French are going to establish a lot of trading posts along the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and they are all supporting these trade networks. Places like Detroit, Michigan, started as a French fur trading post, as did Green Bay, Wisconsin. A little closer to us, we have St. Louis. Now, this was probably one of the last ones established, one of, not the last, but St. Louis is definitely going to start out as a French town, as a trading post. A little closer even to us, St. Genevieve, one of the oldest European settlements west of the Mississippi. St. Genevieve is definitely a French settlement. Now, the fur trade is going to be really important in St. Genevieve, but more importantly is the desire to mine lead that exists just to the west of St. Genevieve. And so St. Genevieve is going to be important. It's right on the Mississippi. It's going to be able to export the lead that is mined here in Missouri, which is one of the largest lead producers in the United States, either north or more typically probably south to New Orleans for shipment back to France. Cape Girardeau, one of our very close neighbors, Cape Girardeau, starts out as a French settlement. It actually starts as the Cape of a man by the name of Girardot, Girdot. And on maps, it was just noted as the Cape of Girardot. A cape is a body of water or a body of land that sticks out into a small piece of water. So in our case, Cape Rock was a big rock that stretched out into the Mississippi. The Army officer Girardot had a trading post there, and later it was just noted on the map as the Cape of Girardot. And you can see how that name eventually changes. Biloxi, and probably the biggest city that would be most impactful is New Orleans, starts out as, of course, French. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit. They came with their hands outreached to the natives in peace. That is true. Also, very few French women ever came to New France. And this is going to have a couple of effects. Number one, it's going to keep your population pretty low. No reproduction by the French. Now, did some French women come? Absolutely. They stayed primarily in Montreal, primarily in Quebec, stayed primarily in New Orleans, and many actually came to St. Genevieve and a few to St. Louis. But other than that, very few French women are going to be found out on the frontier of Louisiana. So that is one effect, is that the French population itself is going to be kept low. The second effect is French men here in America for a number of years are looking for companionship. And they realize it's just right under their very eyes. And they are going to intermarry with native Indian women. This is going to give them an advantage. First of all, they can have a family, have companionship. But more importantly, the French realize by intermarrying with native people, they now have access to that tribe, tribal hunting grounds, tribal trapping grounds. And in fact, if a French fur trader could intermarry with a chieftain's daughter, he may actually get exclusive rights to the fur trade from that tribe. So think about how wealthy that could make a French fur trader. And as we said in class, are the French using the Indians? Sure they are. Absolutely. Were there relationships between French and Indian women that were relationships of mutual caring and love? Absolutely. And in fact, there are going to be a large mixed population, a population of half French, half Indian. These people are going to be called métis. And they're actually going to hold a very stable and high-ranking level in society of both the French and Indian cultures for a long period of time. And finally, the French did not force Christianity on the Indians. Yes, they would prefer that they convert to Catholicism. Again, France is a big Catholic nation. And they sent priests out to preach the gospel, but they did not force conversion upon the Indians like the Spanish had. And so this is going to result in a much different relationship between the Indians and the French, as opposed to the Indians and the Spanish, or the Indians and even the English a little bit later. In fact, here's a quote from the American historian Francis Parkman. He says, Spanish civilization crushed the Indian. And I think if we stop and think for a moment, we can really understand how that happened. He is denying them of their liberty, and as well as their spiritual liberty. English civilization scorned and neglected the Indian. Very true. The English really looked down on the Indian as someone who was barely human, and they were in the way of English expansion. And finally, Parkman says, French civilization embraced and cherished him. And that's certainly true. They took quickly to the native Indian ways of doing things. They adopted Indian customs very quickly as far as how to treat with other people and give gifts and things like that. So I like this quote. I think it sums up the Indian relationship, the native Indian relationship between those three European countries very, very well. And this is the end of section 3 about New France. So stay tuned. We'll get to section 4 a little bit later. Everyone have a good day.